On the night of May 31st, 2009, 228 people boarded an Air France flight in Rio de Janeiro. They were businessmen returning from conferences, tourists heading home after Brazilian vacations, families with young children, a prince, a composer, 9 employees who had just won an all-expenses-paid trip as a reward for their hard work. None of them knew that in just a few hours they would vanish into the darkness of the Atlantic Ocean. Their disappearance would spark the longest, most expensive underwater search in aviation history. And when the wreckage was finally found nearly 2 years later, the truth it revealed would shake the aviation industry to its core. This is the story of Air France Flight 447. The aircraft that would carry these 228 souls was an Airbus A330 registration Fox Golf Zulu, Charlie Papa. It was just 4 years old, practically new by aviation standards. The A330 was considered one of the safest aircraft ever built. Since entering service in 1994, the type had never suffered a fatal accident in passenger operations. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering equipped with fly-by-wire technology that made it nearly impossible to crash through pilot error alone. Or so everyone believed. The flight was scheduled to depart Rio de Janeiro at 10:29 in the evening local time. It would fly northeast across the Atlantic, passing through the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a band of weather near the equator known for spawning massive thunderstorms. The journey to Paris would take approximately 11 hours, because of regulations limiting pilot duty time to 10 hours. Air France assigned 3 pilots to the flight. Captain Marc Dubois, 58 years old, was a veteran aviator with nearly 11,000 hours of flying experience. He had been with Air France for over 2 decades and had logged more than 1,700 hours specifically on the A330. He was the kind of pilot passengers dream about having at the controls: calm, experienced, professional. Joining him were 2 co-pilots. David Robert, 37, was the more senior of the 2. He had over 6,500 hours of total flight time and had made 39 trips on the South America route. But Robert had an unusual background for someone in the cockpit. He had risen through the ranks at Air France and had actually transitioned into a management position. He was on this flight primarily to maintain his flying certification, logging hours in the cockpit, while his real career was behind a desk. The 3rd pilot was Pierre-Cédric Bonin, just 32 years old. He was the least experienced of the 3 with roughly 2,000 hours of flight time. Bonin had come up through Air France's internal training program, meaning he had learned to fly almost exclusively on highly automated Airbus aircraft. He had never flown smaller, more basic planes, where pilots learn the fundamentals of stick and rudder flying. This gap in his training would prove catastrophic. Among the 216 passengers that evening were people from 33 different countries. There were 126 men, 82 women, 7 children, and 1 infant. Prince Pedro Luiz of Orléans-Bragança was returning to Luxembourg after visiting relatives in Rio. He was just 26 years old, 3rd in line to the abolished throne of Brazil, and a grand-nephew of the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. Silvio Barbato was a renowned composer who had conducted symphony orchestras across Brazil. He was traveling to work on a new project. Erich Heine, 41, was a member of the executive board of ThyssenKrupp Steel, one of Germany's largest industrial companies. Michael and Ann Harris were an American couple from Louisiana. Michael, 60, was a geologist working for Devon Energy in Rio de Janeiro. They were heading to Paris for a training seminar and a vacation. Their family would later describe them as people who loved life and loved everyone. Glass half full kind of people. Perhaps the most heartbreaking story belonged to 9 employees of CGED, French Electrical Equipment Company. They had won an all-expenses-paid trip to Brazil as a reward for being the company's top salespeople. They were allowed to bring a partner or friend, and a company executive joined them as well. These were people at the peak of their careers, celebrating their success. They never made it home. And then there was Christine Badre-Schnabel and her 5-year-old son, Philippe. Christine and her husband shared a fear of flying. They had made a decision that many nervous travelers make. They would take separate flights. That way, if something happened to one plane, their children would not be orphaned. Christine and Felipe boarded Flight 447. Her husband took an earlier flight with their 3-year-old daughter. He landed safely in Paris. He would never see his wife and son again. At 10:29 p.m. local time, the Airbus A330 pushed back from the gate at Rio de Janeiro's Galeão International Airport. The takeoff was routine. The aircraft climbed into the darkness and turned northeast, beginning its long journey across the Atlantic. For the first few hours, everything was normal. The pilots chatted casually, monitored their instruments, and communicated with air traffic control. At 1:35 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time, the aircraft made its last radio contact with Brazilian controllers as it passed a waypoint called Inti-Ita-Iuel, about 350 miles off the coast of Brazil. From this point forward, the plane would be in a radar dead zone, out of range of ground-based tracking systems, invisible to the outside world. At 1:55, Captain Dubois woke David Robert from his rest break. The captain was planning to take his own scheduled nap. After attending a brief handover between the two co-pilots, Dubois left the cockpit at 2:01 and 46 seconds. He told the younger pilots he would be in the rest cabin if they needed him. Pierre-Cedric Bonnet was now at the controls. David Robert sat beside him in the left seat, the position normally occupied by the captain. Ahead of them lay the Intertropical Convergence Zone, where towering thunderstorms rose into the stratosphere. At 2:06, Bonin called the cabin crew to warn them of upcoming turbulence. 2 minutes later, the pilots adjusted their course 12 degrees to the left, trying to avoid the worst of the storms showing on their weather radar. But they did not deviate far enough. Other aircraft in the area that night made much wider turns to avoid the weather. Flight 447 flew almost directly into it. The outside temperature was warmer than forecast, which meant the still fuel-heavy aircraft could not climb above the storms. They would have to fly through them. At approximately 2:10 a.m., the aircraft entered a region of high-altitude ice crystals. What happened next would unfold in just 4 minutes and 24 seconds. And it would kill everyone on board. The Airbus A330, like all modern aircraft, relies on small tubes mounted on the outside of the fuselage to measure airspeed. These tubes, called pitot probes, work by measuring the pressure of air flowing into them. That pressure is compared to the static air pressure to calculate how fast the plane is moving. The pitot tubes are equipped with heaters to prevent ice from blocking them, but these heaters have limits. On this night, the aircraft flew into a cloud of ice crystals so dense that they overwhelmed the heating elements. Within seconds, all 3 pitot tubes became blocked. The computers could no longer determine how fast the plane was flying. At 2:10 and 5 seconds, the autopilot disconnected. A cascade of warnings flooded the cockpit. The flight control computers, no longer receiving reliable airspeed data, automatically downgraded from what Airbus calls normal law to alternate law. This was a critical change that the pilots may not have fully understood. In normal law, the A330's computers protect the aircraft from dangerous situations. They will not allow a pilot to put the plane into a stall no matter how hard they pull back on the controls. The computers simply override any input that would exceed safe limits. But in alternate law, these protections disappear. The pilot has full authority and full responsibility. Bonin announced that he had the controls. What happened next defies easy explanation. Perhaps startled by the sudden disconnection of the autopilot. Perhaps disoriented by the darkness and turbulence. Perhaps confused by the rapidly changing airspeed indications on his display. For whatever reason, Bonin pulled back on his side stick, pitching the nose of the aircraft sharply upward. This was exactly the wrong thing to do. The aircraft began to climb at an alarming rate, nearly 7,000 feet per minute. For comparison, a normal climb rate for an airliner at cruise altitude is just a few hundred feet per minute. The plane shot upward like an elevator, rapidly losing airspeed as it climbed. The stall warning activated. A synthetic voice called out the word that should have immediately told the pilots what was happening. Stall. Stall. A stall occurs when an aircraft's wings exceed their critical angle of attack, the angle at which air can no longer flow smoothly over the wing surface. When this happens, the wing stops generating lift and the aircraft falls. Recovery from a stall is one of the most basic skills taught to pilots. You push the nose down to reduce the angle of attack at power and let the aircraft regain flying speed. But Bonin did not push the nose down. He kept pulling back. Within seconds, the aircraft reached its maximum altitude of approximately 37,900 feet. It could climb no higher. The airspeed had dropped so low that the wings could no longer support the aircraft's weight. Flight 447 had entered a full aerodynamic stall. And then something happened that would seal the fate of everyone on board. The stall warning stopped. This was not because the stall had ended. It was because of a quirk in the aircraft's programming. The A330's computers are designed to suppress the stall warning when the measured airspeed drops below 60 knots, because at such impossibly low speeds the computer assumes its data must be faulty. The warning is considered unreliable, so it shuts off. The pilots were now in the worst possible situation. The aircraft was in a deep stall falling from the sky, and the one warning that might have told them what was happening had gone silent. At 2:11 and 32 seconds, Bonin cried out in frustration. "Damn it, I don't have control of the plane! I don't have control of the plane at all!" Robert, the more senior co-pilot, announced that he was taking over. "Left seat taking control," he said. But what Robert did not know, what he could not know because of the design of the Airbus cockpit, was that Bonin was still pulling back on his own side stick. In most aircraft, the control columns are mechanically linked. When one pilot moves their controls, the other pilot's controls move too. Both pilots can feel what the other is doing. But Airbus designed the A330 with independent side sticks. Each pilot has their own controller, and they do not move in unison. If one pilot is pulling back while the other is pushing forward, the inputs are simply averaged together. Robert thought he had taken control. He pushed his stick forward, trying to lower the nose. But Bonin was still pulling back. The aircraft averaged their inputs and continued its deadly descent. At 2:11 and 43 seconds, Captain Dubois burst back into the cockpit. He had been resting for less than 10 minutes when the turbulence and commotion woke him. He demanded to know what was happening. "What are you doing?" he asked in French. The literal translation of his words was cruder. "What the hell are you doing?" Robert's response was devastating in its honesty. "We've totally lost control of the plane. We don't understand at all. We've tried everything." The aircraft was now falling at over 10,000 feet per minute. The nose was pitched up at 16 degrees, but the plane was plummeting, not climbing. The angle of attack, the critical measurement that shows whether a wing is about to stall, had exceeded 40 degrees. A normal angle of attack during cruise flight is around 2 or 3 degrees. 40 degrees is catastrophically high, and still no one in the cockpit spoke the word stall. The warning had sounded 75 times during the emergency. Not once did any of the 3 pilots acknowledge it or discuss the possibility that the aircraft had stalled. At 2:12 and 2 seconds, Bonin said something chilling. "I have no more displays." Robert added, "We have no valid indications." The confusion in the cockpit was total. In the final minute of the flight, the captain began to piece together what was happening. He watched the instruments. He listened to the cacophony of warnings. And finally, he understood. "No, no, no," he shouted. "Don't go up. No, no." But Bonin was still pulling back. The captain's realization had come too late. "Climb, climb, climb," Robert urged, as if trying to will the aircraft to stop falling. Bonin's response revealed the depth of his confusion. "But I've been at maximum nose-up for a while," he said. It was then that Captain Dubois finally grasped the horrible truth. "You're pitching up," he told Bonin. The aircraft was now below 10,000 feet and falling fast. They had been at 38,000 feet just 3 minutes earlier. In his final moments, Bonin seemed to understand what he had done. "Well, we need to," he began, but he never finished the thought. At 2:14 and 23 seconds, co-pilot Robert cried out, "Damn it, we're going to crash. This can't be true." 5 seconds later, at 2:14 and 28 seconds, Coordinated Universal Time. Air France Flight 447 struck the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The aircraft hit the water intact at a vertical speed of nearly 180 feet per second. The impact was not survivable. 228 people were dead. The last words recorded by the cockpit voice recorder came from Pierre-Cédric Bonnet, the 32-year-old pilot who had held the nose up throughout the entire emergency. "But what's happening?" he asked. He never got an answer. When dawn broke over the Atlantic on June 1, 2009, Air France Flight 447 had been missing for hours. The aircraft had failed to make its scheduled contact with controllers in Dakar, Senegal as it crossed into African airspace. It had never arrived at its destination in Paris. By mid-morning, French officials acknowledged what everyone already feared. There was no hope for survivors. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean, more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest coastline, an aircraft carrying 228 people had simply ceased to exist. At Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, families who had come to collect their loved ones were met instead by crisis counselors. Air France set up a support center at Terminal 2D, staffing it with physicians, psychologists, and specially trained volunteers. In the days that followed, the airline contacted close to 2,000 people connected to the victims. But even as families began the impossible process of grieving, investigators faced an equally daunting task. They had to find the aircraft. The Bureau of Enquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, known by its French acronym BEA, took charge of the investigation. They knew approximately where the plane had been when it sent its last automated maintenance messages. They estimated that the wreckage would be somewhere within a 40 nautical mile radius of the aircraft's last known position. That search area covered thousands of square miles of open ocean. The water in that region is among the deepest in the Atlantic, averaging around 13,000 feet. The seafloor is dominated by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, an underwater mountain range with peaks and valleys that would make any search incredibly difficult. And then there was the problem of time. The aircraft's black boxes, the flight data recorder, and cockpit voice recorder were equipped with underwater locator beacons. These beacons, called pingers, emit an acoustic signal that can be detected by specialized equipment. But the batteries that power these beacons are only certified to last 30 days. After that, they fall silent. The clock was ticking. On June 6th, 5 days after the crash, the Brazilian Navy made the first major discovery. They found debris floating on the surface approximately 38 nautical miles north of the aircraft's last known position. Over the following days and weeks, search teams recovered more than 600 pieces of wreckage and the bodies of 50 victims, including Captain Marc Dubois. Analysis of the recovered debris and autopsies of the victims provided investigators with their first clues. The wreckage showed no signs of fire or explosion. The bodies showed injuries consistent with a high-speed impact with water, not with a mid-air breakup. This told investigators something crucial. The aircraft had hit the ocean largely intact. It had not broken apart in flight. But the debris floating on the surface was only a small fraction of the aircraft. The fuselage, the wings, the engines, and most importantly, the black boxes were somewhere on the ocean floor. Finding them would require an underwater search of unprecedented scope and difficulty. The first phase of the underwater search began almost immediately. French naval vessels equipped with sophisticated acoustic equipment arrived in the search area, listening for the pingers from the black boxes. For weeks, they crisscrossed the ocean, towing hydrophones through the water, straining to detect the faint chirp of the locator beacons. They heard nothing. By early July, the 30-day battery life had been exceeded. If the pingers had been working at all, they were now silent. The chance of finding the wreckage quickly had vanished. A second phase of searching began in July, using side-scan sonar to map the seafloor. The search vessels methodically covered grid after grid of ocean bottom, looking for anything that might be the wreckage of an aircraft. The terrain made the work agonizingly slow. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a chaotic landscape of underwater mountains, some rising thousands of feet from the abyssal plain, separated by deep valleys and canyons. An aircraft could be hidden in any number of crevices or covered by sediment. After months of searching, Phase 2 ended without success. The black boxes had not been found. The main wreckage had not been located. The cause of the crash remained unknown. For the families of the victims, this was torture. They had lost their loved ones, and now they were being denied even the basic closure of knowing why. Every aviation accident, no matter how tragic, typically yields answers. The black boxes are recovered. The investigation determines what went wrong. Lessons are learned. Safety improves. But Flight 447 had simply vanished, taking its secrets with it. A third phase of searching was conducted in the spring of 2010. This time, investigators focused on areas that had not been thoroughly covered in previous searches. They used a combination of side-scan sonar and autonomous underwater vehicles, robotic submersibles that could dive to the extreme depths of the search area. Again, they found nothing. By mid-2010, the search had cost tens of millions of dollars. 3 separate phases had failed. The wreckage seemed lost forever. But the investigators refused to give up. They commissioned a statistical analysis from a company called Metron Specialists in Search Theory, who had helped locate other lost vessels, including the SS Central America, a gold-laden ship that sank in 1857. Metron's scientists applied a technique called Bayesian inference to the problem. They gathered all available data about the flight, including the last known position, the drift patterns of the debris that had been recovered, the areas that had already been searched, and the characteristics of the seafloor. They combined this information with probability models to create a new map showing where the wreckage was most likely to be. Their analysis pointed to an area that had received relatively little attention in previous searches, a region closer to the center of the original search circle. The scientists calculated that there was a high probability of finding the wreckage within a limited radius of the aircraft's last known position. Armed with this new analysis, the BEA organized a fourth and final search phase. If this failed, they would likely have to accept that the wreckage might never be found. The fourth phase began in late March 2011. A team led by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the same organization that had found the Titanic, deployed 3 state-of-the-art autonomous underwater vehicles called REMUS 6000. These torpedo-shaped robots could dive to depths of 20,000 feet and conduct systematic sonar surveys of the ocean floor. For a week, the robots methodically scanned the seafloor in the area identified by the Metron analysis. On April 3, 2011, one of the vehicles returned with images that made investigators gasp. There, on a relatively flat and silty area of the ocean floor at a depth of nearly 13,000 feet, lay the wreckage of Air France Flight 447. The debris field was surprisingly compact, measuring only about 200 by 600 meters. This confirmed what investigators had suspected from the floating debris. The aircraft had hit the water in one piece and had broken apart on impact rather than disintegrating at altitude. The wreckage had then sunk directly to the bottom with minimal horizontal drift. Within the debris field, investigators could see engines, wing sections, landing gear, and large portions of the fuselage. They could also see something else: bodies. More than 100 victims were still trapped within the remains of the aircraft, lying on the ocean floor where they had rested for nearly 2 years. The discovery of the wreckage was only the first step. Now came the even more delicate task of recovering the black boxes and, if possible, bringing the victims home. A French cable ship called the Ile de Seine arrived at the site in late April. It carried a remotely operated vehicle called the Remora 6000. A deep-diving robot equipped with cameras and manipulator arms capable of retrieving objects from the seafloor. On April 26th, the Remora made its first dive. Operators aboard the Ile de Seine watched their monitors as the robot descended through nearly 4 kilometers of darkness, its lights illuminating a world that had never seen the sun. The first objective was to locate the flight recorders. Investigators had studied thousands of photographs of the wreckage taken by the REMUS vehicles, and they had identified likely locations based on where the recorders would have been mounted in the aircraft's tail section. On May 1st, the Remora found the flight data recorder chassis. But there was a problem. The crash survivable memory unit, the part that actually contains the recorded data, was missing from the housing. It had separated on impact and was lying somewhere else in the debris field. Later that same day, the memory unit was found. The robot's mechanical arms carefully grasped the bright orange container and placed it in a recovery basket. The flight data recorder, the device that had recorded every parameter of the aircraft's final flight, was brought to the surface. The next day, May 2nd, the cockpit voice recorder was located and recovered. This device had captured every sound in the cockpit during the emergency. Every word spoken by the pilots, every warning that had sounded every input they had made to the controls. Both recorders were in remarkable condition despite having spent nearly 2 years in the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. They were immediately placed in containers of fresh water to prevent corrosion and transported to the BEA's laboratory in Paris. The world held its breath. After 2 years of mystery and speculation, the truth about what had happened to Flight 447 was about to be revealed. Within weeks, the BEA began releasing preliminary findings, and what they revealed shocked the aviation community. The aircraft had not been brought down by a catastrophic mechanical failure. It had not been destroyed by the weather. The engines had been functioning perfectly. The flight controls had been working normally. Flight 447 had crashed because the pilots had made a series of errors that they never recognized or corrected. They had stalled a perfectly functional aircraft and had then inexplicably kept the nose pitched up for nearly the entire 4-minute descent. The stall warning had sounded 75 times. Not once did any of the 3 pilots acknowledge it. Not once did they discuss the possibility that the aircraft was stalled. Not once did they attempt the standard recovery procedure of pushing the nose down. How was this possible? How could 3 trained pilots crash a state-of-the-art airliner through what amounted to a basic flying error? The answer, investigators concluded, lay in a perfect storm of factors: inadequate training, confusing cockpit design, the physiological effects of surprise and stress, and the unintended consequences of automation that had made flying so safe that pilots rarely practiced fundamental flying skills. While the black box analysis continued, recovery operations at the crash site pressed on. Between May 5th and June 3rd, 2011, the Remora recovered 104 additional bodies from the wreckage. Combined with the 50 victims recovered from the ocean surface in the days after the crash, this brought the total to 154. 74 victims were never found. Their bodies remain somewhere in the depths of the Atlantic, lost to the sea forever. The French government chartered ships to bring the recovered remains and wreckage back to France. Forensic experts worked for months to identify the victims, providing at least some measure of closure to families who had waited 2 agonizing years for news. In Paris, the BEA assembled the recovered wreckage in a hangar, laying out the pieces of the aircraft like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Investigators pored over every fragment, every wire, every component, looking for any evidence of mechanical failure that might have contributed to the crash. They found none. The aircraft had been airworthy. The accident was entirely the result of the crew's response to the icing of the pitot tubes and the subsequent loss of reliable airspeed information. On July 5th, 2012, more than 3 years after the crash, the BEA released its final report. The 224-page document detailed every aspect of the accident, from the technical failure that initiated the emergency to the human factors that turned a recoverable situation into a catastrophe. The report concluded that the crash resulted from a combination of factors. The temporary inconsistency between the measured airspeeds, likely caused by ice crystals obstructing the pitot probes, led to the disconnection of the autopilot and a reconfiguration of the flight control system to alternate law. The crew's inappropriate response to the loss of indicated airspeeds caused the aircraft to enter a stall. The crew never understood the situation, never identified the stall, and never made inputs that would have enabled recovery. The BEA made 25 safety recommendations covering everything from pitot tube design to pilot training to cockpit displays. But for the families of the 228 victims, the question of accountability remained unanswered. Who was responsible? Was it the pilots who had made the fatal errors? Was it Air France which had not adequately trained them? Was it Airbus, whose aircraft had systems that may have contributed to the confusion? Was it the regulatory agencies that had certified the problematic pitot tubes? The search for legal accountability would take even longer than the search for the wreckage itself. To understand how 3 experienced pilots could crash a functional aircraft, we need to examine the technical and human factors that converged on that dark night over the Atlantic. The initiating event was the icing of the pitot tubes. These sensors, about the size of an adult's hand, are mounted on the outside of the aircraft and are critical to flight operations. They measure the pressure of air flowing into them, which allows the computers to calculate how fast the plane is moving. Modern aircraft depend on accurate airspeed information for everything from engine management to flight control inputs. The pitot tubes on Flight 447 were made by a French company called Thales. They were a specific model designated C16195AA. And these particular tubes had a known problem. Since 2007, pilots had been reporting incidents of airspeed anomalies on A330 and A340 aircraft equipped with these Thales pitot tubes. The incidents occurred at high altitude in certain atmospheric conditions when ice crystals would accumulate in the probes faster than the built-in heaters could melt them. The European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, was aware of at least 9 such incidents before the crash. Airbus knew of approximately 20. A smaller French airline called Air Caraïbes had experienced 2 serious incidents on its A330 fleet and had proactively replaced its Thales tubes with a newer model. Air France knew about the problem too. In 2008, the airline had asked Airbus for information about the incidents and for recommendations on how to address them. Airbus responded that a newer version of the Thales pitot tube, the BA model, might offer improved reliability. Air France decided to replace the pitot tubes on its entire A330 and A340 fleet. The first batch of new probes arrived on May 25, 2009, just 6 days before Flight 447 departed Rio. The first aircraft was retrofitted on May 30th, 1 day before the crash. Fox Golf, Zulu, Charlie, Papa. The aircraft assigned to Flight 447 was scheduled to have its pitot tubes replaced as soon as it returned to Paris. It never got the chance. On June 1st, the very day the aircraft disappeared, Air France began systematically replacing the suspect tubes across its fleet. By June 17th, every A330 in the Air France fleet had been retrofitted. 2 months later, both EASA and the American Federal Aviation Administration issued mandatory directives requiring all operators to replace the problematic Thales AA pitot tubes. Pitot. The timing was cruelly ironic. Had Flight 447 departed just 1 day later, it might have had the new tubes installed. Had Air France moved faster on the replacement program, the aircraft would have been safe. But the icing of the pitot tubes was only the trigger. It should not have been fatal. Pilots deal with instrument failures regularly. There are procedures for handling unreliable airspeed indications. The aircraft can be flown safely without accurate speed readings by using known pitch and power settings. What made the pitot tube failure deadly was the crew's response to it. When the autopilot disconnected, Pierre-Cédric Bonin was at the controls. The young co-pilot had relatively limited experience, most of it in the highly automated environment of modern Airbus aircraft. He had never flown light aircraft where pilots learn basic airmanship skills. He had never been trained to handle unreliable airspeed at cruise altitude. He had never practiced recovering from a stall at 38,000 feet. When the unexpected happened, Bonin reacted instinctively, and his instincts were wrong. Investigators believe that Bonin may have been responding to a spurious indication on his instruments. When the pitot tubes iced over the indicated airspeed dropped sharply and then recovered erratically. There is some evidence that Bonin may have seen an indication that the aircraft was descending, which could have prompted him to pull back on the stick. There is also a theory that the flight directors, the instruments that show pilots what pitch and bank angle to maintain, may have contributed to the confusion. When the autopilot disconnected, the flight directors briefly went offline. When they came back, they automatically commanded a climb attitude to maintain the vertical speed the aircraft had at that moment. Some investigators believe Bonin may have been following this erroneous guidance. Whatever his reason, Bonin pulled the nose up. The aircraft, already flying near its maximum altitude where the margin between flying too fast and flying too slow is extremely narrow, quickly exceeded its stall angle. And then the stall warning activated. "Stall, stall," the synthetic voice announced. This should have been unmistakable. The stall warning on an Airbus is designed to be impossible to ignore. It includes a loud alarm and a voice announcement. Every pilot knows what it means. Every pilot knows how to respond. Push the nose down, add power, get the aircraft flying again. But Bonin did not push down. He kept pulling up. Why? This is the question that has haunted aviation psychologists and training specialists ever since the black boxes were recovered. One factor may have been Bonin's understanding of how the Airbus fly-by-wire system works. In normal law, the aircraft's computers prevent the pilot from exceeding certain limits. If a pilot pulls back too hard, the computers will ignore the excessive input and keep the aircraft within safe parameters. The pilot literally cannot stall the aircraft in normal law. But when the airspeed data became unreliable, the computers switched to alternate law, which removes many of these protections. Bonin may not have fully understood this. He may have believed subconsciously that the aircraft would not let him stall, that the computers would protect him. This false sense of security may have led him to discount the stall warning as a false alarm. There is also the phenomenon that psychologists call startle effect. When humans are suddenly confronted with an unexpected and threatening situation, our cognitive abilities degrade. We may experience tunnel vision, focusing intensely on one aspect of the situation while ignoring others. We may have difficulty processing new information. We may fall back on deeply ingrained habits, even if those habits are inappropriate for the current situation. Bonin had been flying in a calm routine environment for 4 hours. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Alarms blared, lights flashed. The controls felt different. The instruments showed impossible readings. The aircraft was buffeting in turbulence. It was dark. He was tired. Under these conditions, Bonin may have experienced a form of cognitive paralysis. Unable to make sense of what was happening, he defaulted to a basic instinct: pull up. In his mind, pulling up meant climbing, which meant safety, which meant getting away from the threatening situation. What he didn't understand was that pulling up was killing them. David Robert, the more senior co-pilot, was in a position to intervene. He had more experience. He should have recognized what was happening. But Robert was dealing with his own cognitive overload. When the emergency began, he focused on trying to understand the cascade of failure messages appearing on his screen. He was analyzing, not flying. By the time Robert realized that something was fundamentally wrong with their attitude, valuable seconds had been lost. When he announced that he was taking control and pushed forward on his stick, he didn't realize that Bonin was still pulling back. The Airbus side stick design meant that Robert couldn't feel what Bonin was doing. Their inputs were silently averaged together, producing a compromised control input that satisfied neither pilot's intentions. And then there was Captain Dubois. The most experienced pilot on the aircraft had left the cockpit for a routine rest break. When he returned, the aircraft was already in a deep stall, falling at 10,000 feet per minute. He had no context for what had happened. He spent precious seconds trying to understand the situation instead of taking immediate control. By the time Dubois grasped what was happening, it was too late. The aircraft had fallen too far, lost too much airspeed, and was too deeply stalled for recovery. The final BEA report was measured in its language as safety reports must be, but between the lines it painted a damning picture of systemic failures. The pilots had not been adequately trained. The airline had not prioritized the replacement of known defective equipment. The aircraft's warning systems had behaved in ways that confused rather than clarified. The cockpit design made it difficult for one pilot to know what the other was doing. Yet despite these findings, establishing legal responsibility proved extraordinarily difficult. A criminal investigation into the crash began just days after the accident in June 2009. French prosecutors opened an inquiry into potential manslaughter charges against Air France Airbus and possibly individuals within both organizations. For years, investigating judges gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and consulted experts. In March 2011, a French judge filed preliminary manslaughter charges against both Air France and Airbus, but the investigation dragged on. In September 2019, more than 10 years after the crash, the investigating judges announced they were dropping all charges. They concluded that the accident was caused by a combination of factors that had never occurred before and that could not have been foreseen. The victims' families were devastated. They had waited a decade for accountability only to be told that no one was legally responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. But the families fought back. They appealed the decision. And in May 2021, the Paris Court of Appeal ruled that there was sufficient evidence to put Air France and Airbus on trial for involuntary manslaughter. The trial began in October 2022 and lasted 2 months. It was the first time in French history that corporations of this magnitude faced criminal manslaughter charges. Prosecutors argued that Air France had failed to properly train its pilots for unreliable airspeed events and had been too slow to replace the defective pitot tubes. They argued that Airbus had been aware of problems with its speed indication systems and had not done enough to address them. Defense lawyers countered that both companies had complied with all applicable regulations. They argued that the crash was ultimately caused by pilot error, specifically Bonin's inappropriate control inputs and the crew's failure to recognize and recover from the stall. The prosecution's case was complicated by the fact that proving corporate manslaughter under French law requires demonstrating a direct causal link between the company's actions and the deaths. With so many contributing factors, establishing that link was extraordinarily difficult. In December 2022, in an unusual move, the prosecutors themselves recommended acquittal. They said the evidence presented at trial was insufficient to prove criminal responsibility. The crash, they concluded, was mostly the result of pilot error. On April 17, 2023, nearly 14 years after the crash, the Paris Criminal Court delivered its verdict. Air France and Airbus were both acquitted of involuntary manslaughter. The judges ruled that while errors had been made, there was no certain link of causality between those errors and the crash. The companies could not be held criminally responsible. In the courtroom, families of the victims broke down. Some sobbed, others sat in stunned silence. After 14 years of waiting after an investigation that spanned continents and cost tens of millions of dollars after a 2-month trial that laid bare the failures of 2 of France's most prestigious companies, no one would be held accountable. Michel Mamayou, whose daughter was on the flight, spoke for many when he addressed reporters outside the courthouse. 14 years of legal proceedings to get here, he said. This is a lot for us to take. Nelson Faria Marinho, a Brazilian father who lost his son, was more blunt. France isn't serious, he said. It manufactured a killer plane, and they're covering everything else up. The acquittal was not the end of the legal battle. French prosecutors appealed the verdict. In September 2025, 16 years after the crash, a new trial began in the Paris Court of Appeal. The families of the victims vowed to continue their fight for accountability. But while the legal proceedings continue, the aviation industry has already implemented the changes that emerged from the BEA's investigation. And in that sense, the 228 victims of Flight 447 did not die in vain. The crash prompted a fundamental reassessment of how pilots are trained. Before the accident, high-altitude stalls were not a significant focus of airline training programs. Pilots practiced stall recovery at low altitudes during takeoff and landing scenarios. They rarely, if ever, experienced what it felt like to stall an aircraft at cruise altitude. After Flight 447, that changed. Regulatory authorities in the United States, Europe, and around the world mandated new training requirements. Upset Prevention and Recovery Training, or UPRT. became mandatory for airline pilots. This training puts pilots in simulators that can replicate the sensations of unusual attitudes and requires them to recover the aircraft using proper techniques. High-altitude stall recognition and recovery became a specific training requirement. Pilots now practice what to do if they lose reliable airspeed at cruise altitude. They learn to fly the aircraft using pitch and power settings rather than relying on airspeed indications. The crash also exposed what experts call the automation paradox. Modern aircraft are so reliable, so capable of flying themselves, that pilots rarely need to exercise basic flying skills. But this very reliability means that when the automation fails, pilots may lack the skills and experience to take over manually. Air France's own internal documents, which came to light during the investigation, showed that the airline had identified this problem before the crash. The company had noted a generalized loss of common sense and general flying knowledge among its pilots. Long-haul pilots who spend most of their time monitoring automated systems rather than actually flying were particularly vulnerable. The tragedy of Flight 447 served as a wake-up call. Airlines began placing greater emphasis on basic airmanship skills. Pilots were encouraged to disconnect the autopilot periodically and fly the aircraft manually to maintain their proficiency. Technical changes were implemented as well. The problematic Thales pitot tubes were replaced across the global fleet of Airbus wide-body aircraft. New standards for pitot tube certification were developed taking into account the ice crystal icing phenomenon that had not been adequately considered before. Airbus made changes to its flight control software to prevent the autopilot from being re-engaged following unreliable airspeed events. The company also worked on improvements to the stall warning system to make its behavior more intuitive in degraded flight conditions. Air France eventually replaced its entire A330 fleet with newer aircraft. In January 2024, the airline began phasing in Airbus A350 aircraft to replace the aging A330s. The last of the Air France A330s is scheduled to be retired by 2030. The flight number itself became a memorial. Shortly after the crash, Air France changed the number of its regular Rio to Paris service from 447 to 445. Later, it was changed again to 485. The number 447 will never be used again by Air France. In Paris, a memorial to the victims stands at Père Lachaise Cemetery, one of the most famous burial grounds in the world. In Rio de Janeiro, another memorial evokes 228 transparent birds taking flight into eternity. Every year on June 1st, families gather to remember their loved ones. They light candles. They speak their names. They tell stories of the lives that were cut short that night over the Atlantic. Prince Pedro Luiz, who was returning from visiting his relatives. Silvio Barbato, the composer, with melodies still unwritten. Michael and Anne Harris, the American couple who loved life and loved everyone. The 9 employees of CGED, who had won a trip as a reward for their excellence. Christine Badre-Schnabel and her 5-year-old son Felipe separated forever from a husband and father who had chosen a different flight. 228 people who boarded an airplane expecting to wake up in Paris. The crash of Air France Flight 447 changed aviation safety in ways that are difficult to fully measure. Pilots today are better trained. Aircraft systems are more robust. The industry is more aware of the dangers of over-reliance on automation. But the fundamental lesson of Flight 447 is both simple and profound. Technology can fail. Computers can malfunction. Sensors can freeze. And when they do, human beings must be ready to take control. In the end, an aircraft is just a machine. It does not understand danger. It does not fear death. It cannot panic, but it also cannot think. When the unexpected happens, when the carefully programmed systems encounter a situation they were not designed to handle, everything depends on the human beings in the cockpit. On the night of June 1st, 2009, 3 pilots faced a situation they had never trained for, never anticipated, and never understood. They had 4 minutes to save 228 lives. They did not succeed. The question that haunts the aviation industry. The question that drives every safety improvement and every training update is this: if it happened again, would we be ready? The answer we must hope is yes, because somewhere tonight, another airliner is crossing the Atlantic. Another crew is flying through darkness, trusting their instruments, relying on their training, carrying hundreds of souls who are trusting them with their lives. For those passengers and for all of us who fly, the lessons of Flight 447 must never be forgotten. 228 people lost their lives that night in the darkness over the Atlantic Ocean. They deserved answers. Their families deserved justice. The world deserved to know the truth. It took nearly 2 years to find the wreckage, more than 3 years to complete the investigation, 14 years to bring the case to trial, and still the legal battle continues. But the most important truth about Flight 447 is not who was to blame. It is what we learned, and what we learned may save countless lives in the years to come. That is the legacy of Air France Flight 447. That is what we must remember. This is their story. May they rest in peace.